Welcome to The Explainer. Picture this. It's early 1942, and the United States is reeling. Just months after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the American public is drowning in a torrent of bad news from the fighting fronts. The Japanese Empire seems absolutely invincible, expanding its territory across the Pacific with terrifying speed. America was desperate. They urgently needed a win. They needed a way to strike back, and most importantly, a way to prove that the Japanese mainland wasn't completely untouchable. What resulted was one of the most daring, highly classified, and seemingly impossible missions in all of military history. This is the ultimate high-stakes underdog story. Right from the top, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an urgent mandate. Japan had to be bombed as soon as possible. But how? The military had exactly 0 bases in Asia close enough for a strike. Plus, the Navy had no carrier-based planes with the range to reach Tokyo without putting the few remaining aircraft carriers at massive risk. Enter James "Jimmy" Doolittle. He was a famous military test pilot and a brilliant aeronautical engineer, and he understood exactly what was at stake. As he put it, an attack on the homeland would sow doubt in the minds of the Japanese people, and Americans badly needed a morale boost. This wasn't just about destroying factories, it was about shattering the myth of Japanese invulnerability. Part 1. A crazy idea takes flight. To pull this off, the military needed a seemingly absurd solution, pitched by Navy Captain Francis S. Lowe. The idea? Launching heavy twin-engine Army bombers directly from the deck of a Navy aircraft carrier.
Okay, let's dive into this massive logistical headache. You can't just slap any plane onto a carrier deck. The mission required an aircraft that could carry a 2,000-pound bomb load over a massive cruising range of 2,400 nautical miles. Planners had a few options on the table, but none were perfect. The B-26 Marauder? Well, its takeoff characteristics were way too questionable for a short flight deck. The B-18 and B-23? Their wingspans were simply too wide. They'd smash right into the ship's superstructure. So that left the B-25 Mitchell as the Goldilocks choice, the only viable option. But there was a huge catch. The B-25 only had a range of about 1,300 miles. To make this work, they would have to nearly double its fuel capacity. Now this is where Doolittle's engineering brilliance really shines. To double the fuel and keep that heavy bomb load, they had to ruthlessly strip the bombers of every single ounce of excess weight. Heavy defensive belly turrets? Gone. Essential combat radios? Removed. And my personal favorite detail, in one of the most ingenious and desperate modifications of the entire war, they crafted fake tail guns out of wooden broomsticks. They literally painted broomsticks black and stuck them out the back to hopefully trick Japanese fighter pilots into keeping their distance. Unbelievable, right? The preparation for this was just monumental. Under Doolittle's confident leadership, these heavily modified, stripped-down bombers were crowded onto the USS Hornet. But getting them on the ship was only half the battle. They actually had to learn how to fly off the thing. 140 volunteers went down to Eglin Field in Florida for 3 weeks of intense, highly secretive training. A Navy flight instructor named Lieutenant Henry L. Miller was brought in to teach these Army pilots an entirely new, incredibly dangerous skill. They had to practice hauling a fully loaded bomber into the air in just a fraction of the distance they were used to. Part 2. Discovered the early launch. The plan was originally set for a dusk attack, but out in the churning Pacific Ocean, a sudden crisis hit the task force. So the crucial point is right here at 3:10 a.m. on April 18th. American radar detected a Japanese picket boat far outside the expected patrol area. The task force had been spotted. The element of surprise was totally blown. Doolittle and the Navy commanders faced an agonizing choice: abort the entire mission or launch immediately. And you know what? They chose to launch. But instead of being 400 miles from the coast, they were forced to launch 820 miles out. Every single pilot climbing into their cockpit that morning knew the terrifying math. They simply did not have the fuel to survive and reach their safe landing zones in China. Just imagine being on that deck. The Pacific was rough, wildly pitching the carrier's bow up and down in the swells. These massive, land-based bombers, stripped of their defenses and lacking any fighter escort whatsoever, were revving their engines, waiting for the exact split second the ship's bow pitched upward to hurl themselves into the sky. It was incredibly dangerous. One wrong move meant crashing into the ocean. Yet remarkably, all 16 aircraft managed to get airborne. And against all odds, the bombing run itself was a stunning operational success. Arriving in broad daylight instead of under the cover of darkness, the raiders dropped an estimated 14 tons of bombs on the Japanese mainland. They claimed hits on virtually all of their assigned military and industrial targets in Tokyo,
Kobe, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense, for sure, but it was inaccurate. The flak was bursting just to the left or right of the planes. Miraculously, despite losing the element of surprise, the raiders did not lose a single aircraft or airman to enemy fire over Japan.
Part 3. The Fall, Crashing in the Dark. They have successfully struck the Empire, but now their fuel gauges were dropping dangerously fast as they headed toward unoccupied China.
As the bombers left Japan and headed south toward the Chinese coast, things went from bad to worse. A severe storm set in over the East China Sea. The pilots desperately climbed to 6,000 feet, hoping to get over the weather, but it was no use. Night fell. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. Imagine the sheer terror for a second. You're flying a stripped-down bomber, entirely blind on instruments, heading into a torrential storm in pitch blackness, listening to your engines literally starve for fuel, knowing the ground is out there somewhere in the dark.
The result was absolutely devastating. Out of the 16 planes that launched from the Hornet that morning, 15 violently crashed or were abandoned as crews bailed out into the stormy night skies over China. The single exception? One crew whose plane was burning fuel way too fast. They had to turn north and were forced to land in the Soviet Union. Every single aircraft from the mission was lost.
Part 4. The Aftermath and Strategic Impact. On paper, losing every single plane looked like a total operational disaster, but it reshaped the entire war. Put yourself in Jimmy Doolittle's shoes for a moment. After bailing out in the dark, he came down splashing into the mud of a Chinese rice paddy. He gathered his crew, looking at the wreckage of their mission. At that moment, at his absolute lowest point, Doolittle was thoroughly convinced the raid was a colossal failure. Because he had been forced to launch early and lost every single bomber, he genuinely expected he would be court-martialed the moment he stepped foot back in the United States. But history had a massive twist waiting for him. Far from a court-martial, when news of the raid reached home, American morale absolutely soared. Doolittle, who you can see here boldly wiring Japanese medals of friendship onto a bomb before the raid, was celebrated as a national hero. Instead of facing a military trial, President Roosevelt personally promoted him 2 full ranks to brigadier general and awarded him the Medal of Honor for his extreme valor. Even more miraculous was the human survival rate. Despite the violent crashes and the terrifying bailouts in pitch darkness, 69 of the 80 American airmen actually escaped capture or death. This incredible survival story was largely thanks to the immense bravery of Chinese civilians, guerrillas, and soldiers. They risked everything to smuggle the Americans right through Japanese lines to safety. And this brilliantly illustrates the true power of the raid. It was a psychological earthquake. The physical damage to Japan's factories was minimal, but the Japanese military was deeply embarrassed that an enemy had pierced their defensive perimeter, and they panicked. They were forced to pull 4 critical Army fighter groups back from the South Pacific just to defend the homeland. Even more importantly, it pushed Admiral Yamamoto to aggressively expand their defensive line by attacking Midway Island. And that specific decision led directly to the Battle of Midway 2 months later, a catastrophic defeat for the Japanese Navy that permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. But we absolutely cannot explain this history without acknowledging its darkest chapter. The Japanese military was furious over the raid and the Chinese assistance given to the downed American pilots. In retaliation, they launched a brutal reprisal campaign in China. It is estimated that a staggering 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed. The infamous Unit 731 even moved into the area, deliberately deploying horrific germ warfare by seeding towns with dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. The cost of America's morale boost was paid incredibly heavily in Chinese blood. The Doolittle Raid remains one of history's most fascinating military paradoxes. Think about it. A desperate plan, built on a crazy idea, modified with painted broomsticks, launched entirely by mistake 400 miles too early, and ending with every plane destroyed in the dark. Yet it shattered an empire's sense of invulnerability and set the stage for Allied victory in the Pacific. So, I leave you with this. How did a mission with minimal physical damage and the loss of every single aircraft manage to completely change the course of World War II? It's a profound reminder that in war, the psychological blow can sometimes be far, far heavier than the bomb itself. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.